The European battlefields of the Second World War were a theater of thunderous steel, roaring engines, and desperate survival. Soldiers on both sides relied not only on courage, but on machines that were supposed to carry them to victory. Among these, the American Sherman tank carved a reputation that has echoed through history. To the Germans, it seemed like a mass-produced, mediocre beast of war, easily destroyed by their mighty Tigers and Panthers. But hidden inside the Sherman was a secret weapon that most German troops never truly grasped. It wasn't its gun. It wasn't its armor. It wasn't even the speed or mobility. It was something far less visible, something tucked away behind the steel plates, humming quietly inside every vehicle. The radios. At first glance, a radio hardly seems like a weapon. Compared to a high-velocity cannon or thick armor, it sounds insignificant, almost laughable. But in the chaos of war, communication can be the difference between confusion and coordination, between being outnumbered and outmaneuvering the enemy. What the Germans never fully realized during those crucial years was that the American Sherman tanks were rolling into battle equipped with the most advanced, most reliable, and most widespread radio systems the world had ever seen. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to step back to the 1930s, when tank warfare was still in its infancy. Most armies, including Germany, were experimenting with armored units. The lessons of World War I had shown the potential of mechanized warfare, but also its shortcomings. Radios back then were bulky, fragile, and rare. Many tanks still communicated the old-fashioned way, with flags, hand signals, or runners braving gunfire to deliver a single order. In such conditions, coordinated maneuvers were nearly impossible. When the war erupted in 1939, the German Wehrmacht stunned the world with its lightning-fast blitzkrieg. Columns of tanks, infantry, and aircraft punched deep into enemy lines with breathtaking coordination. To observers, it looked like German armor was unstoppable, always several steps ahead of their enemies. And indeed, German tanks often did have radios, especially command vehicles. But here lies the catch. Not all of them. Many of the ordinary Panzer III and Panzer IV units still lacked two-way radios in the early campaigns. Some had only receivers, not transmitters. Orders could be given to them, but they couldn't reply. A tank commander who wanted to report his situation or request support often had no direct way to do it. The German high command relied on carefully rehearsed tactics, strict planning, and fast-moving officers to keep the momentum. Now, compare this to the Americans. When the United States entered the war in 1941, their Armored Corps was still young, still learning. But there was one critical decision made early on. Every single Sherman tank rolling off the production lines would be fitted with a radio. Not some, not just the commander's tanks. Every tank. No exceptions. This was a massive investment, a deliberate choice that seemed mundane at the time, but would prove revolutionary. Think about it. You're a German tank crew in the fields of Normandy, 1944. You're dug in, waiting for the enemy. You know your Tiger tank has thicker armor. You know your 88mm cannon can slice through a Sherman at long range. You're confident, at least at first. Then the Shermans appear, not one, but a dozen, then 2 dozen. They're not charging blindly. They're fanning out across the hedgerows. One takes cover behind a barn. Another darts forward. A third suppresses your position with machine gun fire. Before you can adjust, artillery begins to fall on your flanks, timed almost perfectly with the Sherman's movements. It feels uncanny, as if the Americans can read your mind. But they don't have magic. They have radios. Inside each Sherman, a crewman sits with a headset, tuned into a constant stream of chatter. Platoon leaders give orders in real time. Crews call out enemy positions. Infantry coordinate with armor. Aircraft link up with ground forces. Artillery units adjust fire instantly. The battlefield becomes a living network, all tied together by the crackling voice on the radio. And the Germans? Too often they're cut off, isolated, forced to guess what their allies are doing, or to wait for runners who may never arrive. This is why many American veterans, when asked years later, insisted that the true secret of the Sherman wasn't the gun or the armor, but the ability to talk, to coordinate. The German tank aces may have scored impressive kill counts, but their victories were often isolated duels. The Americans fought as a swarm. When one Sherman was knocked out, the others adjusted instantly, circling the threat, calling in air support, overwhelming the lone Tiger until its crew was forced to abandon it. The irony is that the Germans never quite believed it. Their propaganda painted the Sherman as weak, inferior, a laughable opponent. And on paper, they weren't entirely wrong. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman with a single shot from over a mile away. But the battlefield is not a laboratory. In the chaos of smoke, dust, and broken terrain, superiority doesn't always belong to the tank with the biggest gun. It belongs to the side that can think, move, and react faster. And so the story of the Sherman's radios is a story about foresight, about how something invisible, something intangible, could decide the fate of battles. By 1944, the Americans weren't just fielding tanks. They were fielding a connected war machine. Armor, infantry, artillery, and air power all moving as one, linked by technology the Germans could never fully match. But here's the real twist. The Germans did notice. In captured Shermans, they discovered the radios. They could see the equipment inside, but they dismissed its importance. They thought of it as just another gadget, not a game changer. They didn't realize that while they were focusing on bigger cannons and thicker armor, the Americans were quietly winning the war communication. As the war dragged on, this invisible advantage became more obvious. German tank crews began to feel it, an eerie sense that the Americans were always just a step ahead, always appearing where they were weakest. They blamed spies, bad luck, even betrayal. Few suspected that the answer was right there, humming inside the enemy's tanks. And so, the stage is set. What follows is not just a story of machines, but how the humble radio turned the tide of battles, reshaped tactics, and revealed that in modern warfare, knowledge truly is power. The battlefields of Western Europe were a cruel proving ground for both men and machines. Every clash between American and German armor revealed stark contrasts, not only in design philosophy, but in the very way each side thought about war. To the Germans, tanks were predators. Each Tiger or Panther was a powerful hunter, designed to destroy anything in its sights. To the Americans, the Sherman was not an individual champion. It was a piece of a greater whole, a single organ inside a larger, living body. And the blood that kept this body alive was communication. In the summer of 1944, after the Normandy landings, American armored divisions began their slow, brutal push through the French countryside. The bocage terrain was a nightmare of narrow lanes and thick hedgerows, perfect for ambushes. German tanks and anti-tank guns waited like spiders in their webs. Allied losses were heavy. Yet again and again, the Shermans kept pressing forward, not recklessly, but methodically. One tank would spot movement and instantly broadcast a warning. Others would shift into position. If artillery support was needed, the radio call went out, and within minutes shells whistled overhead. When infantry were pinned down, Shermans would respond to shouted requests over the shared net, advancing to suppress machine gun nests. German accounts from these battles describe the frustration vividly. A Tiger tank might destroy 2, 3, even 4 Shermans in a matter of minutes. But while it was locked in this duel, other Shermans flanked it unseen, guided by constant updates over their radios. Once its position was exposed, the Tiger became a target not just for tanks, but for fighter bombers screaming down from the sky, summoned by nothing more than a few words over the wireless. The German crews knew their machines were superior on paper, but they were being hunted in ways they couldn't understand. What made the American system so devastating was not just the presence of radios, but the standardization. Every Sherman carried essentially the same set, typically the SCR, 508, or its later versions. These were rugged, relatively compact, and most importantly, easy to operate. Crews were trained to use them efficiently, with discipline. They weren't just for commanders barking orders. Any crew, in any tank, could report enemy contact, request fire support, or coordinate with infantry. This created a web of awareness across the battlefield that multiplied the effectiveness of every unit. Now contrast this with German practice. Early in the war, not all German tanks had radios. By 1941, most did, but the Germans still divided them into transmitters and receivers. Command tanks could send orders, while the majority could only listen. Two-way communication was rare at the platoon level. And even when it existed, German doctrine emphasized rigid command structures. Orders flowed downward, not upward. A frontline tank commander might spot an opportunity, but relaying it through the chain of command could take minutes, even hours. The Americans, by contrast, trusted their crews to make calls on the fly, supported by a doctrine of flexibility and initiative. The radios weren't just hardware. They represented a philosophy. One of the most striking examples came during Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. After weeks of grinding stalemate, the Americans unleashed a massive aerial bombardment, then sent in waves of infantry and armor. German defenses crumbled under the onslaught, but what turned a breach into a breakthrough was a rapid exploitation by Sherman units, communicating constantly over their radios. Columns fanned out in multiple directions, bypassing strong points, enveloping retreating units, and linking up with airborne reconnaissance. German commanders, cut off from one another, struggled to even understand where the attacks were coming from. In many cases, they had no reliable communications to rally their forces. The result was chaos. Entire German divisions melted away, while the Shermans surged forward like water pouring through a shattered dam. The irony was brutal. German engineers had given their tanks the thickest armor, the most powerful guns, and yet their doctrine lagged behind in something as simple as communication. A Tiger tank might command fear, but it could not be everywhere at once. The Sherman, weaker individually, became far deadlier in numbers, bound together by invisible signals bouncing through the air. Even more fascinating is how this advantage extended beyond the battlefield. The Americans used their radios not only for tactical fighting, but for coordination with supply lines. Fuel convoys, repair crews, and replacement units could be directed quickly to wherever they were needed most. This kept the armored spearheads moving relentlessly forward. German units, by comparison, often bogged down not for lack of courage or firepower, but because they simply couldn't coordinate resupply under pressure. A Tiger abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts was no better than a Sherman burned out on the roadside. Radios meant movement. Movement meant momentum. And momentum in war is everything. But the story doesn't end there. American radios weren't just confined to tanks. Infantry squads increasingly carried portable sets. Forward observers relayed targets to artillery batteries miles away. Fighter pilots swooped down to receive instructions directly from ground troops. This kind of combined arms coordination was unprecedented in its scope. The Sherman tank was at the heart of it, serving as both a weapon and a hub for communication. A platoon of Shermans didn't just bring firepower. It brought the ability to tie an entire sector of the battlefield together into one coordinated effort. For the Germans, this was maddening. Their doctrine prized initiative at higher levels, but on the ground, their systems often left units isolated. When communications broke down, even elite formations fought as if blindfolded. The Allies, meanwhile, thrived on the constant chatter of their networks. One German officer, captured after the war, reportedly remarked that the Americans fought like ants, cut off one group, and another immediately filled the gap, guided by signals you could never silence. And there's another layer of irony. The German military actually pioneered the use of radios in tanks during the interwar years. In the 1930s, when most armies still relied on flags, the Germans experimented with equipping panzers with wireless sets to coordinate blitzkrieg maneuvers. But by the height of the war, their production struggles and doctrinal rigidity had eroded that early advantage. The Americans, with their immense industrial capacity, standardized what had once been a German innovation, and then took it further than the Germans ever imagined. By 1945, the difference was glaring. American armored thrusts surged across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, moving faster than the Wehrmacht could respond. Shermans rolled into towns ahead of schedule. Infantry followed in step. Artillery fire was adjusted in minutes instead of hours. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural. How could an enemy with such inferior tanks always be in the right place, always striking from the flank, always backed by perfectly timed support? The truth was simple. The Shermans had ears and voices. The German tanks, more often than not, had only eyes. By the final year of the war, The Sherman secret advantage was no longer a subtle edge. It had become a decisive factor. The Allies were no longer inching forward. They were racing across Europe, pushing the Wehrmacht back towards homeland. And though German tanks still terrified American crews, the reality was undeniable. The Shermans didn't win by standing toe-to-toe in duels of armor and firepower. They won by fighting as a collective, bound together by invisible voices in the ether. Radios had transformed them from vulnerable machines into a coordinated swarm that simply could not be stopped. Consider the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. The German army launched a desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, striking at thin American lines. Chaos erupted as fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, cutting off their greatest advantage. For a time, it seemed as though the old German magic had returned. Columns of Tigers and Panthers smashed through villages, overrunning isolated outposts. But even in the whiteout, even in confusion, the Americans clung to their radios. Tank commanders relayed positions of enemy breakthroughs. Units under siege sent out desperate calls that were answered within hours by reinforcements guided through the blizzard. The Shermans fought not as scattered groups, but as a network. When the weather cleared, that network became lethal. American tanks guided fighter bombers straight to German columns. Coordination between artillery and armor was seamless, allowing battered units to regroup and strike back. By late December, the German offensive ground to a halt. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble collapsed into retreat. The Allies, once again, turned defense into counterattack, not through superior tanks, but through superior communication. The quiet hum of the radio had once more shaped the outcome of a campaign. As the Shermans rolled into Germany in 1945, the contrast between American and German design philosophies reached its climax. The Tigers and Panthers that remained were formidable beasts, symbols of German engineering brilliance. But they were also lonely hunters, often cut off from one another, abandoned for lack of fuel, or destroyed after being overwhelmed. The Sherman, meanwhile, rolled forward in endless waves. Crews swapped stories over the radio nets, laughed in moments of reprieve, and barked urgent warnings when ambushes appeared. For every tank destroyed, two more closed the gap, guided by a constant stream of coordination. There are countless stories from veterans that reveal the power of this invisible advantage. One American commander described how a platoon of Shermans, pinned down by a Panther at long range, was able to circle behind it because the first tank under fire calmly reported its situation. The others adjusted, moving unseen to the terrain until they struck from flank. The Panther never knew what hit it. In another case, Shermans advancing through a French village called in artillery strikes on German strongpoints within minutes, saving infantry from what could have been a massacre. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Radios turned moment of chaos into opportunities for coordination. The Germans, of course, captured Shermans and examined the radios. They knew, technically, what the Americans were doing, but they underestimated it. They believed their superior gunnery and armor would always outweigh something as intangible as communication. And yet, as the months wore on, they found themselves increasingly trapped, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed by forces that seemed to move as one. Many German tank crews simply could not understand how a supposedly inferior machine always managed to outnumber, outflank, and outlast them. The truth was not in the steel, it was in the signals. Looking back, it is tempting to measure tanks by their specifications: armor thickness, gun caliber, engine power. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought in mud, smoke, and fear. In that reality, a tank's greatest strength is not always its gun. It is the ability to fight as part of something larger, to adapt instantly, to coordinate under fire. The Sherman embodied this principle. While the German army often relied on the heroics of individual aces, the Americans relied on the collective power of communication. And in the end, it was a collective that triumphed. The story of the Sherman's radios carries an even greater lesson. It reminds us that in modern warfare, information is as decisive as firepower. A well-timed warning can save dozens of lives. A clear command can turn retreat into counterattack. A coordinated strike can collapse an enemy position in minutes. The Americans understood this, even if they did not always articulate it. They built their tanks not to be the strongest predators, but to be the most connected. In doing so, they laid the foundation for the kind of warfare we know today, where satellites, drones, and digital networks dominate the battlefield. And perhaps the most haunting irony is that German soldiers, brave and determined as they were, never truly knew why they were losing. Many believe they were simply overwhelmed by numbers, crushed by American industry. And in part, they were right. But numbers alone do not explain why Sherman seemed to appear in the right place at the right time, why artillery fire always landed so quickly, why infantry and armor moved like two hands of the same body. What they never grasped, at least not fully, was that the real American advantage was not steel. It was a voice in every crewman's ear, the invisible thread connecting one tank to another. As the war ended, with Shermans rolling into Germany's shattered cities, their radios still crackling with chatter, the truth was undeniable. The German dream of armored supremacy had been undone not just by American industry, but by American communication. The Tiger may have been the king of the battlefield in isolation, but the Sherman was never alone, and that, more than anything else, sealed the fate of the war in Europe. Today, when we look back at black and white photographs of Shermans trundling through ruined towns, it is easy to see them as humble machines, outclassed by their German rivals. But those photographs cannot capture the voices echoing inside. Commands, warnings, encouragement, all weaving a network of life across the battlefield. That unseen element, that chorus of coordination, was a true weapon. In the end, the Germans never fully knew. They never fully grasped that the hum inside those green steel beasts was their undoing. And yet it was. The Sherman's radio was not just a piece of equipment. It was the heartbeat of an army. And it was a heartbeat that never stopped until victory was won.